Hi, everybody. Welcome to Creating Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools. I'm Amanda Morin.
And I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. And today we are talking about behavior in the classroom. I don't know, there's just such a heavy feeling about this. And I think that, especially for educators who are neurodivergent, they can probably think back on some of their experiences growing up and recognize maybe what worked or what didn't, or maybe what worked but also didn't feel good, depending on what your definition of worked is. I know for me, I have some very specific memories about being ADHD and going through school and constantly feeling like I was in trouble. Specifically in fifth grade, we had this behavior management system in our classroom, these little index cards. Amanda, I don't even know if I've ever told you this story before.
No, I've never heard this one before.
So we had these index cards and we wrote our name on these index cards. And we started out the week with 5 of them. And every time we got in trouble, had a missing assignment, whatever, we had to go and turn in one of our index cards into this basket. So for me, because my desk was moved into the back corner of the classroom, and then I would get in trouble, I would have to then find one of these cards in my desk, which was a disaster. And then I would have to do this walk of shame across the classroom with my card and turn it into the basket and then walk back.
I'm having retroactive anxiety for you, Emily.
Yeah, it was like, and because it was like missing assignments or I was calling out or, just doing, I don't know. My teacher I remember she explained this, that she felt like this was a positive way to manage behavior because you started the week with all 5 of your cards. And so all you had to do was keep your cards. And then at the end of the week, basically what happened was if you still had all 5 of your cards, you got a little certificate to go home. Those little certificates that's like, I had a great week, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And you got to put whatever remaining cards you had into a drawing. And if you got your card pulled, you got to go to the teacher's lounge and pick out either a candy bar or a soda from the vending machine in the teacher's lounge. And I was desperate to win the sugar because who wouldn't be? And to get to go into the teacher's lounge, like that was a whole very exciting thing. And, but I just remember feeling so defeated. And I also remember this time, so my mom and I had this conversation. It was kind of this come to Jesus conversation. And so this was the week I was going to turn in all my work. I was going to keep all my cards. I wasn't going to get in trouble. So it got to be Friday afternoon. So all the kids who had all 5 of their cards, we lined up at the teacher's desk. And I brought up all 5 of my cards and I showed them to her. And she looked at me and she said, well, Emily, you must not have turned in a card when I told you to.
Oh.
And she proceeded to open her grade book and look through to see if I'd had any zeros that week from missing assignments. And at that point, I was like, well, I don't really care about this anymore. And it was just so consistently embarrassing.
Oh.
I wish that any person had actually given me some strategies, or had understood how hard some of those things were for me, that I wasn't just being defiant or uncaring or lazy, but really I just learned so many things about myself that year that I felt like were true, that really were very unhelpful. And ultimately, I think that's when we need to think about how do we manage behavior in our classrooms? What's the message that we're sending?
Yeah.
And are we actually teaching the skills? Because I think a lot of times these things are not.
And interestingly, as you're telling that story, maybe not everybody can see this, but my eye started twitching. Like literally my eye started to twitch because I got upset thinking about how that must have felt to you. And it makes me wonder how the other students in the classroom felt every time they had to watch somebody do that, if they worried it was going to be them next, right? These systems that we put into place because it's how we've known how to do it, right? As teachers, we've been taught this is the way to do it, that this is a behavior management system. I think we sometimes don't anticipate how much effect they have not only on the students who are, having to turn in their cards or having to move their clip or having to do whatever, but the students around them and the sort of the fear or the anxiety or whatever that is that puts into place. And it tells me, you and I both were classroom teachers. We both started out trying to figure this out, as most new teachers do, trying to figure it out. And a lot of times that's by watching the teachers around us, right? And learning from them. And when we talk about behavior management or behavior interpretation, or however you want to talk about this in classrooms, there's an unlearning that needs to happen as educators, right? We need to start not just learning new ways, but letting go of the old ways and realizing why they're not working the way we expect them to. What we experience as students is probably not going to work for the students we have in our classroom. And to realize, like, if we want culture change, we have to do things differently. And that's not about shaming teachers. 100% not about shaming teachers. It's about saying there are new ways to think about this. There are new ways to do this. And let's figure those out together.
It's really hard when there's a specific culture or tradition or whatever that's been really just part of how schools have been run for a really long time. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean changing everything overnight. It just means having that opportunity to sit and think and see what tweaks might be able to be made. One point that I often make when I'm talking to educators about this, though, too, is that those types of behavior systems, reward-based or punishment-based, if they work, it's only that they are gaining short-term compliance. They aren't actually solving any problem. And for the kids that they do, quote unquote, work for, kids who are maybe more part of the neuronormative population, they don't need that.
Right.
I mean, they're going to follow the classroom norms just based on what's expected because that's what they're able to do. And so recognizing, being able to individualize these things, work with individual kids, and just rethinking a lot of this is really important. And so I have a conversation coming up that we'll listen to with Elizabeth Sautter. So that'll be up in just a moment.
So when I first began teaching, I realized how much I didn't learn in my teacher prep program about how to understand and support the students in my classroom, right? So behavior management was a big gap in my knowledge, and I turned to the methods I saw around me with other teachers, but it was clear that not all of my students were thriving under that one-size-fits-all approaches that myself and my colleagues were using. And those are the same practices that I didn't thrive under when I was a student. As I broadened my knowledge base and started working with more students and the families of students with learning disabilities, and then became a parent to neurodivergent children of my own, it became so clear to me that the environments and practices that we provide to all learners didn't give them what they needed to thrive. Emily and I are committed to helping make schools create the change we need to create neurodiversity-affirming environments that don't rely on one-size-fits-all methods and that remove the barriers that stand in the way of success for neurodivergent learners. And to support that, we do educator trainings. We work with school districts, we work with them virtually, and we work with them in person. So if you would like to learn more about bringing Emily or myself to your school district through virtual means or through in-person means to support changing the way you look at learners and the behavior management systems you use, head to neurodiversity-affirmingschools.com or click in the link in the show notes to find out more.
Elizabeth Sautter is a speech-language pathologist, speaker, author, and trainer with expertise in social communication, emotional regulation, and executive functioning. She's the author of Make Social and Emotional Learning Stick: Practical Activities to Help Your Child Manage Emotions, Navigate Social Situations, and Reduce Anxiety, along with a ton of other resources, including an online course and community for parents. Elizabeth collaborates with the Zones of Regulation team as a trainer and is co-author of the Zones children's books, Card Decks, and Games. Elizabeth, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Absolutely. I'm really happy to be here with you.
So I want to start us off with the same question we've asked all of our guests. How do you define neurodiversity-affirming practices?
I look at it as we all have brains that are neurodiverse and some are neurodivergent, but it's not a deficit or disorder and not something to be fixed. It's something to be celebrated and supported, just like any other person learning different things. And so looking at it with acceptance and awareness and advocacy versus looking at it as a disorder or a deficit. So neurodiversity affirming practices are supporting with strengths and following interests and making sure that we're not calling out and having a fix-it model or conforming to the neuromajority.
I feel like there have been so many things that really have shifted over the last decade plus. I always use the example, my other podcast, the Neurodiversity podcast, we started it in 2018 and we didn't even use the term neurodiversity. It actually wasn't part of the name. We rebranded eventually because that really was our focus. And so there's been such a shift in supporting neurodivergent students. And I feel like this is something that you are very equipped to talk about just because you've been working with neurodivergent students for a long time and had some ideas that have been adopted. So what are some of the shifts that you really see that have taken place over this time?
Yeah, well, as a speech pathologist, I was trained in graduate school many, many, many years ago, and we didn't hear about the term neurodiversity, let alone neurodiversity-affirming practices in grad school or beyond. And I was trained with the medical model, which was the fix-it and deficit disorder, creating goals to conform to neuromajority, and especially being focused on social emotional learning. It was a lot of, I did social skills groups back then. So I'm super grateful for the neurodiversity movement, and autistic voices primarily are called out in my world as children became to be adults and had a voice about this. Super grateful. And I started listening to podcasts and hiring consultants. And, at this point in time, I had actually already authored a book and a lot of resources, and I had to rethink and change things. The movement has really shifted us from not looking at this as a problem, but opportunities for bringing that awareness and advocacy when needed. And that's when the growth and the connection can happen, and when we can have more true inclusion and belonging. And so that started happening, especially when I am one of the authors of the Whole Body Listening Larry series, which became super popular because in the world of social emotional learning, we do a lot of breaking down abstract concepts, which is helpful because they're super confusing. Like, what does respect really mean? I hate that word anyway, but how do we break these things down so that we can figure out how to navigate social situations? And so one of the things that we thought we were doing with compassion was breaking down, listen to me and pay attention, because what really are we asking, And so another speech pathologist, Suzanne Truesdale, asked a group of first graders, what does it mean to listen? And they were calling out, sitting still and looking at the speaker and mouth closed. And so it turned into this paper and model of what parts of your body and brain are turned off versus on when you're listening, which then turned into, we were teaching it in the social groups, and, what are back then we were talking about the expectations, and we came up with Whole Body Listening Larry. Kristen Wilson, one of our therapists at the center, I had a center back in the day of occupational therapists and speech therapists, and she made Whole Body Listening Larry on a stick to teach it. And then we made a poster and a book, and it just went viral. But then, mostly autistic voices, but a lot of neurodivergent voices were saying, this is ableist. It was all outlining, looking and mouth quiet and sitting still. And that's not how a lot of people listen, including myself for that matter, and my children that I'm raising and my sister that I grew up with. And so we did a lot of research and consulting, and we changed the books, and it just wasn't enough. So finally we took them off the market. And then the focus group that we had listening to neurodivergent voices, they said, you need to make a new book. It can't just be, because they're going to still use the old books and the posters. And so we did, and we hired a consultant, McAllister Huen, who said, whole body listening is great. It's just that we need to be focusing on whole body regulation. And so that's what the new poster, and it's all about how you listen. All bodies are different. Learn what works for you. And then there's a book called Listen, Learn, and Grow. That's a rhyming format that is all about focusing on understanding how each body part can listen and learn differently and what works for you.
Yeah. I love that ability to turn it over to kids to have some autonomy and to recognize what is regulating for you. Because sometimes when I have this conversation, when I'm talking to educators, I promise you, I can sit there and I can make eye contact and I can have my hands in my lap and I am not hearing a word that you are saying. Like, there is no guarantee that that's what that looks like. But I do think there's use for what you were talking about, like breaking down those concepts and being really explicit with it, which is a very neurodiversity affirming practice. But I think it was adopted so rapidly, it shifted. It wasn't really doing what the ultimate goal of it was. I think all of us as educators have this evolution. We all have this change. That's what the book Amanda and I have written, Neurodiversity-Affirming Schools, is trying to do, is asking people to reflect and look at what they've been doing and how can they shift those practices in order to support their kids. But that's hard. It's a very vulnerable feeling. And as somebody who had been published and whose name was kind of tied with this, can you just share a little bit about your own personal process with that evolution and how you kind of worked through all of that?
Yeah, people have been asking me that a lot. And, it was a vulnerable process. And I went through, the stages of grief in terms of shock and denial at first, maybe like, oh gosh, no, I'm a compassionate therapist. I would never harm anybody and shame anybody. This is helpful to break it down. But then as I really realized, it really is a conformance-based model, and it's based on performance, and it's really based on what we're asking that works for the speaker. It's focused on conformity. It's not focused on what's best for the listener. And so when I realized that, I had to take a step back and just take a pause. And that's when I dove into a lot of podcast listening and a lot of blog reading and book listening and reading and rereading now with a new lens. Kind of when you start to learn about something and you're in denial for a little bit, or, you're buying a car or something, you can't help see it. You see it everywhere. And so that's what it started to turn into. And so then I just couldn't turn it back. And I was just like, now I see this differently, and I can't sit down and not do anything about it. And I'm in the position to either, run away with shame for myself or stand up for what I believe in and humbly be a model of a growth mindset, which is, I've written a whole journal on growth mindset with my son, and do this differently. And now Larry can be a model for that as well. And that's why we use that branding as well, too, so that people would see, instead of it being something completely different, they're like, oh, I have that poster. This is a new poster. What's that about? And then they can dive in to learn more and why we made these changes. But I just felt a huge calling, and it wasn't easy at all. And it's actually really scary and vulnerable.
I bet.
I just couldn't help it. And, we wrote a letter sort of to the community, and it's been really well received.
I think that's so powerful to hear, because I think it's a normal human experience to feel, defensive when somebody's critiquing something that you've said or done. And especially when overall it's been, well received. I know I experienced that. Being able to take that feedback and reflect on it and hear people's lived experiences, it is encouraging how far we've come. You also mentioned the word ableism. That's even a word that I think a lot of people are kind of unfamiliar with, even still. And recognizing that so many of the things that we have done in schools really are based in some of these ableist beliefs that everybody should look the same, behave the same, interact the same, learn the same. And that's just not always true for our neurodivergent kids.
Yeah. Two things that I want to say. I want to back up a little bit, but well, first of all, it wasn't easy.
Right.
None of this was easy. It was huge, time consuming and costly and, advocacy to get it down from publishers and things like that, and have this focus group. But it's just an evolution of what we have to be doing. And the more we resist it, the harder it's going to be. And, for teachers it's not easy to focus on regulation over compliance.
Right.
Because, you have to then have different areas where somebody can stand and maybe have a standing desk and have a place where they can have music in the background and noise canceling headphones. But if our goal is true engagement and processing, then this is what we have to be doing for listening and learning, especially. And I've done a whole workshop with Sarah Ward on empowering listening and learning, focusing on the neurodiversity-affirming practices and how we focus on regulation and executive functioning for widening the bottleneck that we have in our brain for listening and learning. And if we, focus more on compliance and performance, then we're closing that off, because the children and the learners are only focused on sitting still, looking at the teacher, mouth quiet, all the different things. And they're not absorbing what the teachers are teaching, or, they're not picking up what they're putting down, which is what the goal is. So if we really think about the big picture goal, then it just changes the whole overall approach to it. The other thing that I wanted to say is, I think that one of the reasons why it's easier for me to be humble and to pivot is because I too have a neurodivergent brain as undiagnosed dyslexic. And so this was, learning was not easy for me. I made a ton of mistakes. And if I just shut down every time there was a bump in the road, I would be hiding in a closet. And so, I think that when this happened, it was like, my brain is one of those neurodivergent brains, like everything is figure outable because, the main road is not easy. And so I, with integrity, had to move forward in making these changes and shifts.
I always wonder too, like looking forward, I'm like, what in 5 years or 10 years will we look back on and go, oh, whoops, we should have done that differently. I mean, I think even just with my own children, like, they're 16, 14, and 9. And man, I parent that 9-year-old differently than I do the one who's 16, just because you just shift with things. But change is good, and it doesn't have to happen all at once. It can be in small steps as we learn more. And when you know better, you do better.
100%, absolutely. I use that quote all the time.
Yeah.
So for sure, and baby steps and mindset shifts is the start.
Yeah, Elizabeth, thank you so much for talking to me just for this little amount of time. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
I'm so glad that I have had the opportunity to meet Elizabeth and talk to her, because I feel like this is just really such an important conversation. And I want to really just talk about, as we kind of circle back here and reflect on these conversations, about this phrase that I think most of us has probably come across at some point in time, which is that all behavior is communication, which I think is great, but I think we also need to explore what that really means. And when I think about this phrase of all behavior is communication, what that means to me is that when we are looking at behavior, so this external manifestation of actions that somebody is doing, we need to provide context to understand it. We need to look at the reasons why and understand that there is a reason why a student might be exhibiting any particular type of behavior. So often as educators, or sometimes even as parents, I mean, I know, and I just want to say, guilty. Like, I am not perfect with these things, but we have these knee-jerk reactions and view them through this lens of compliance. This is the rule. You didn't do that thing. So therefore, you were being defiant, or you were, just not listening or making a poor choice. But when we contextualize it, that gives us the opportunity to identify and solve the problem that's happening there. So one example that I always think of is this client who I actually worked with, who was a high school student. And we spent a very long portion of one session at one point in time talking about the difference between walking and running, because he was getting super anxious about getting to class on time, and he was bowling people over in the hallways and getting in trouble for running, when technically he was not running. I mean, if you look at the definition, he was correct that he was not running.
He was speed walking.
Yes, it was. This is the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, right? A separate conversation that we had. But ultimately, in order to solve that problem, I could have that conversation with him all day, but we had to contextualize, why is it that you feel this urgency to get there? And solving that problem, rather than just, are you walking or are you running?
Yeah. And I often, when I talk about behavior with educators, with parents, with whomever, I talk about reframing it so we can think of the possibilities instead of the problems. And I think this is the second reason on this circle back. One of the things that I often hear when I'm talking to people about behavior is there's such a heavy emphasis on the word behavior, right? We talk about, the behavior, or the behavior that we're seeing, and it always has a negative connotation to it. You rarely hear somebody saying, oh my goodness, I want to talk to you about behavior, right? As if there's something like wonderful to talk about. As we start looking at behavior in context and not just about compliance, and we start thinking about what's behind what we're seeing, it gives us the opportunity to see the possibilities of behavior as positive things too. there are positive behaviors, right? The way we react to things can be very positive. The way we interact with people can be very positive. And to me, it's super important that we start thinking about behavior beyond just negative behavior, that there are positive things to talk about when we talk about behavior too. And I would love to start having conversations that don't start with behavior, that start with, what are we seeing?
I would almost say positive is good, but also neutral is okay too.
Right.
An observation as opposed to an indictment. And I think also the third piece of the circle back is just something that really is so relevant with my conversation with Elizabeth. And that is that it is okay to make changes.
Yeah.
It is okay to evolve. It is okay to reflect on things and go, wow, I should have done things differently. And you can start now, today, changing some of those things where you see them, but also recognizing we all have blind spots. There might be something in a week or a month or a year, and all of a sudden your awareness might shift with that too. And so you just kind of keep making these gradual changes, these gradual shifts. The fact that you're here listening to this now shows that you're already open-minded enough to consider that, to realize that there might be new ways to do things. It's okay. It doesn't mean that you were wrong or you were doing something bad because you were doing things the way that either you'd been taught or what at the time seemed like the best option. We all make those decisions based on what we know and what we're able to do, just like our students are. And so don't be afraid to kind of try some new things, make some shifts.
And I would just end this conversation by saying, I think it was so brave of Elizabeth to talk about the changes she's made and the reasons that she's made those changes. And I would encourage the people listening to the podcast, those of us who are in classrooms and making changes, don't be hesitant to talk about why, right? Talk about why. And just, again, thank you to Elizabeth for that. I think this has been such a great conversation, and it's a tough topic to talk about. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you next time.